Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now today we're taking a look at the RTX 2080 Ti, almost 7 years to the day since it launched back in 2018. I have what is probably the worst version in terms of heat and noise. This is the ASUS Turbo card, packing 250 watts under a plastic shroud with a single puny fan at the end. Doesn't seem like the best idea, and I'm not going to lie to you, it does get pretty noisy. Here's how it sounds at idle. And here's how it sounds under load. Like a busy airport runway during a blizzard. In terms of temperature, I'm used to these blower cards running at 80 plus degrees, and that's no different here. Nothing really to be concerned with, especially if you have a decent enclosure with lots of airflow. I was running this on an open test bench and it was still fine. This card features 11 gigs of GDDR6 and requires two 8-pin connectors. I've been using this for a couple of days now, and today I'm going to share some benchmarks with you. So let's get straight into it and see how this thing is holding up in 2025. We'll start with Borderlands 4, which hasn't had the best launch on PC, and if we look at the optimal settings guide on the website, it'll actually say something about targeting 30 FPS with a 2080 Ti. That to me seems unspeakable. 30 FPS with a 2080 Ti, what has the world come to? So I decided to target 60 frames per second instead. We don't need to make a massive sacrifice, we only need to turn the graphics down to low and enable DLSS quality. So some of you may see that as a massive sacrifice, but that is necessary in order to hit 60 frames per second with a 2080 Ti. We need the low preset, a DLSS quality mode, which doesn't look too bad, and in return we got 72 frames per second, a 1% low of 54, and a 0.1% low of 39. Games like CS2 aren't going to have any problems here. In fact, you're probably going to want to run the game at lower settings if you're playing competitively. So the very high preset and 8x MSAA probably isn't representative of the options that you choose with a title like this. But this is a GPU benchmark after all, so I just stuck it on very high. I went with 8x MSAA for 219 frames per second. Our 1% low was 95 and our 0.1% low was 44. I then tried GTA 4, and you may be asking why I tested such an old game, and that is because not only is it one of my favourite GTA games, but I've recently been playing around with the Fusion Fix overhaul, and this to me is the definitive way to play this game. We've got things like volumetric fog, better reflections, SMAA, and I think it looks absolutely fantastic. I just wondered how well it ran on this beast of a card, or this once beast of a card, and with the highest settings and SMAA enabled, we were seeing 133 frames per second, a 1% low of 94 and a 0.1% low of 34. We can also switch to Vulkan from DX9 from within the game's menu with Fusion Fix as well, and that's going to give us a smoother gameplay experience on a wide range of hardware, the 2080 Ti included here. I think this is very much a 1080p GPU in 2025, but it will depend on the game. I just stuck with 1080p because a lot of the more demanding and newer titles were best suited to that resolution. Like GTA 5, which we'll play next, this is GTA 5, the enhanced version, of course, 1080p with the maximum RT preset and TAA. We saw 82 frames per second, a 1% low of 70 and a 0.1% low of 64. It's important to remember that the 2080 Ti is capable of ray tracing, of course, an absolute beast at it back in the day. These days, you may want to be a bit more conservative with your ray tracing settings, especially in games like Cyberpunk, which we'll move on to a little later on. But here with GTA 5, the maximum RT preset is fine for plus 60 FPS. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 next at 1080p with the Ultra preset and SMAA 2TX for 75 frames per second. There is a preset that's higher than this, it's called Experimental, and if you enable that, then yeah, you're going to get less than 60 frames per second, a lot if not most of the time. The visual differences are noticeable in some instances, to be honest. The same can be said when comparing the differences between Ultra and High. I just stuck with Ultra as it gave me plus 60 frames per second on this old beast. 75 with a 1% low of 62 and a 0.1% low of 60, so really consistent as well. I've paired this card with an i9-14900K, the best CPU in my possession, but I have limited it to 125 watts so that it doesn't completely overheat underneath my £15 CPU cooler. Oblivion Remastered up next, 1080p with a medium preset. I'm going to stop saying 1080p because I've stuck to that resolution throughout today. We have the medium preset here then with high reflections. The reason I set reflections to high is because otherwise the water looks like it's been painted, so high reflections is better in my opinion. I did have to set DLSS mode to quality, however. Now, it's interesting that at native resolution, even with the low preset, we couldn't consistently hit 60 FPS, so I thought if that was the case anyway and we needed DLSS quality, I may as well go with the medium preset, so that's what I did for 78 FPS overall. Even here there were a few dips and drops below this and below 60, with a 1% low of 58 and a 0.1% low of 29. A few little hiccups here and there, but that's to be expected from my experience with different hardware in Oblivion. Hollow Knight Sliksong next. The particle effects were set to normal and the blur quality was set to high, which is essentially just the highest settings in this game. This isn't going to be a problem for the 2080 Ti, 670 frames per second, 449 is the 1% low and a 0.1% low of 362. You could probably run this at 4K, maybe even 8K if the 2080 Ti supports it, absolutely fine. And you're still going to see at least, well, 60 FPS easily, I'd imagine. I just wanted to include it because it's really popular right now, and I wondered just how good it would run on this old beast of a card. So here's the answer. For Clair Obscur Expedition 33, we have the medium preset and DLAA, so native resolution. Here's 71 frames per second, a 1% low of 58 and a 0.1% low of 52. This gets a little more demanding in and around the more crowded areas, but most of the time we still see plus 60 FPS. You could enable DLSS quality if you wanted to guarantee a more consistent plus 60 FPS average overall, but DLAA is going to be fine most of the time here. Next up we have Assassin's Creed Mirage. I haven't bought the newest Assassin's Creed, which I think is Shadows, because to be honest I have lost interest in this series. Mirage was the last one I played and I actually quite enjoyed it. With the ultra high preset and DLAA, it's running at 98 frames per second on average with a 2080 Ti, so we could probably bump things up to 1440p if we wanted to. The 1% low was 74 and the 0.1% low was 63. I think the last Assassin's Creed I played all the way through was Origins. I used to play that non-stop. I think what it was these days, like Valhalla and Shadows, is that the maps are too big. Like I would have loved that back in the day when I had a lot more time to play these things. Now I just think, yeah, that's way too much effort. I think that's what it is. That's what sort of put me off. I much prefer linear games these days because I don't have to put a whole weekend into playing them. Sounds bad, I know, but just pretty busy these days. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle next, 1080p with a high preset and DLAA for 73 frames per second. The 1% low was 61 and the 0.1% low was 58. You can turn off DLAA and just use TAA instead for a boost to the performance, but this still gave us 60 plus frames per second, so I thought we may as well stick with it, and as you can see it ran pretty fine most of, if not all of, the time. Cyberpunk 2077 up next. First of all, I tried the Ultra preset, and this was absolutely fine, 86 frames per second. This did better than I thought. The 1% low was 61 and the 0.1% low was 50. Of course, we can also use ray tracing, so I then tried the RT Ultra preset and wondered what it would take to hit 60 plus FPS. The answer is DLSS balanced mode. We need DLSS balanced in order to do this, and this gave us 65 frames per second, 1% low of 49 and a 0.1% low of 42. Stay away from the path tracing mode though, because yeah, you're going to need DLSS ultra performance, and even then it's going to look horrible and it's not going to be the best experience in the world, and that's putting it lightly. Red Dead Redemption 2 with the ultra textures and everything else set to high. I think we could have pushed everything to ultra, to be honest, or up the resolution with these settings. Here we saw 98 frames per second, a 1% low of 78 and a 0.1% low of 74. Looks great and runs nicely as well. For Fortnite, I went with the high preset, which includes Lumen High and Nanite. These are two very demanding options, but I wanted to see if the 2080 Ti was capable of handling them. Not only that, but with a plus 60 FPS average, and overall we saw 80 frames per second. The 1% low was 59 and the 0.1% low was 35. So a couple of dips and drops here and there, which isn't to be unexpected, to be honest. With this one, it looked great actually and ran quite well, but Fortnite's an online competitive shooter, so I'd recommend playing with lower settings anyway. Baldur's Gate 3 with the Ultra preset and DLAA for 118 FPS, a 1% low of 70 and a 0.1% low of 50. Not much to complain about with this one, to be honest, and it actually ran a lot better than I was anticipating. To finalise, we'll check out Doom the Dark Ages. First of all, with the medium preset and textures set to 2048 with TAA. This gave us 62 frames per second with a 1% low of 47 and a 0.1% low of 45. This also has a path tracing option, which I then enabled and set DLSS to ultra performance, but it was pretty hopeless in terms of hitting 60 frames per second. The best we could do was an average of 50 here. The 1% low was 41 and the 0.1% low was 39. Honestly, it's going to look quite bad when you start turning the DLSS up or down, depending on how you want to look at it, to the performance and ultra performance settings, and even doing so isn't going to give us 60 frames per second, so pretty pointless turning path tracing on, especially with all the options enabled like I've done here. To conclude though, the 2080 Ti in 2025 is still fine a lot of the time. You may have to enable DLSS in some games. You know what some games are like these days in terms of how they run and engines and optimization, stuff like that, but you're going to still have a pretty decent experience with a 2080 Ti. Nice that it's got 11 gigs of VRAM as well, of course, but you might find that you're limited just in terms of the card's capabilities before you hit that VRAM limit anyway, where you have to reduce the settings in order to get closer to 60 frames per second. The extra VRAM in some instances is therefore sort of not utilised. At higher resolutions it may be, but then again you're going to run into the same issue where you're going to get less than 60 FPS anyway, and the card's going to reach its performance ceiling before it even needs to use the extra VRAM that it has. At least that's the case with some modern titles. Thanks for watching, let me know your thoughts down below, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.